Welcome to Feel, Peel, Thrive, formerly Food Feels Banana Peels, a holistic podcast created to inspire a shift in perspective. Here, we explore what it really means to feel, peel back the layers, and thrive from the inside out. Each episode invites you to consider a shift in your perspective on what it truly means to be healthy, beyond quick fixes or trends, and to see wellness as an empowered, inside-out journey rooted in awareness, accountability, and self-trust. I'm your host, Laura Pfeiffer, and I'm here to guide honest, heart-centered conversations that help you reconnect with your body, realign with your values, and live with greater clarity, connection, and vitality. Because when we learn to feel, we can heal. And when we peel back the stories that hold us back, we make space to thrive. Hey and welcome. Today I am super excited to chat with a good friend and a wonderful human being, Stephanie Keezer. Steph is here to talk to us today about her role as a psychologist and inform us a little bit about how psychology can be very helpful as we navigate the path of ourselves. So Steph is a registered psychologist in Newfoundland, and she believes the success of therapy is built on establishing a safe and meaningful relationship between client and therapist. Stephanie believes in supporting people to identify and acknowledge their own patterns of behavior, examining where they may have developed them and whether or not they are serving the client well in the present context. Stephanie helps people navigate challenges like trauma and PTSD, depression, anxiety, life transitions. She works with stress management, parenting, especially as it relates to challenging behavior and or anxiety in children. She has experience working with adults and children with ADHD and helps them to understand and utilize their unique strengths, as well as promote neuro-affirming strategies to address their needs. Stephanie helps clients harness their own innate strength and resiliency and guides them towards creating the life they want to live. Beautiful introduction. Thank you, Steph, for being here today. It's lovely to speak to you.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. So today we're going to chat a little bit about your role as a psychologist and have you inform us a little bit about some of the things that you can help people navigate on their journey. Things have been very tumultuous for a lot of people of late, and we see a lot of people trying to move toward different modalities for help, moving away perhaps from like that modern medicine pill popping kind of stuffing things down and really looking to get deeper inside. So tell us a little bit about your role and what a psychologist does and how that aligns.
Well, I guess I'll start by saying there are psychologists working in, many fields. So I can speak from, my own practice and my own kind of passion area that I'd like to work in. I think like as a society, we are getting a little bit better at maybe merging the worlds between, traditional medicine and more holistic options. So I have seen definitely an uptake in clients who have tried a variety of things to manage their stress and overwhelm in recent years. And I love working with, interdisciplinary agencies or working with various practitioners and kind of really looking into a holistic, what we call like a wraparound service for our clients. So outside of the things in my bio, I think the bulk of my work is generally focused on, like was briefly mentioned there, establishing patterns of behavior. So everything in life operates in, behavioral patterns, things that we view as overwhelming today or potentially triggering, things that, are not serving us well, that usually have a foundation in our earlier life experiences. So whether you come to me for, depression, anxiety, parenting, getting divorced, your family dynamics are changing, most roads lead back to, where is the struggle in here? How are you feeling this in your body? What is this reminding you of? What is coming up for you as we discuss this? And really going back and looking at all of the paths that kind of led us to this moment and what skills you have developed along the way that we can capitalize on and utilize in this moment to help you as you heal, but also what things may be holding you back or what things may appear to be about one thing at the surface and really actually have a meaning that's much more interconnected. So I always say to my clients, it's like a big, I use the analogy that's out there, a big tangled ball of yarn, of many colors. And today we may be talking about purple, and another day yellow, and another day pink. And those are all the facets that kind of make up your life, both your strengths and also your challenges. And I think the happiest, healthiest people are constantly kind of taking a holistic look at those things and really thinking, what makes me tick? Why am I the way I am? What things in my life are really working for me? And what things would I like to work on? And then that's where a professional like myself comes in, and we can kind of get to the places where you feel like there's a little room for improvement, or perhaps you're feeling are really heavy at the moment.
Beautiful. So deep self-inquiry is what we're kind of along with, the support, somebody holding space for you, and with your psychology background, really then you get into kind of like the deeper aspects of the psyche on your side, the
Right.
analysis and things like that. Absolutely. So tell me, I learned once, and please confirm this for me if in fact it's true, because I've been operating off of this. Our belief systems develop before the age of 8, generally, before our brains are actually able to properly cognize our experiences. Is that correct? Or somewhere in and around there?
Yeah. So definitely our earliest critical language time is definitely, even pre the age of 8. So emotional literacy is generally built even, the biggest foundation up to the age of 3. But brains are neuroplastic, which means they can always be changing. We can always be learning new ways of coping, new ways of interpreting the world. So I guess the notion that there, is that you've kind of been given this roadmap and it stops changing at a young age is not true, and thank goodness, or else my work wouldn't be so meaningful. But definitely, I usually use the analogy of like the lens through which you view the world. So based on your own early life experiences, based on the modeling that you've had from your caregivers, absolutely your emotional range, your emotional literacy, the development of your prefrontal cortex, which is what houses all our most higher order thinking, our ability to regulate our feelings and to interpret the world, all of that is experience based. So that attachment time, that solid time of development early in life really does give us the roadmap by which we tend to take through the rest of our life and apply it. Sometimes, perhaps over and over into a dead end kind of thing, but it's really what's been ingrained. So it normally takes very concerted work if we are looking to change that map. And that's where kind of a second set of eyes and ears in therapy can be a good thing to try to dismantle perhaps what parts of that map again are leading in the direction you want to go, and what parts you've chosen to take with you all of this time when they really weren't serving you. So there is, like, I guess, validity in what you've heard, but also an optimism in that we can continue to grow those skills and change. It just takes more concerted effort later in life, whereas early in life it's just kind of absorbed through osmosis based on the experiences around us.
Right. And likely why we are all so incredibly different as adults and people, depending on your upbringing. If you had safe attachment and bonds with your family or caregivers, that's setting you up for a certain direction in life. And then those of us with unsafe attachment bonds, then it's taking us down another avenue. And for me in my journey, it's been very interesting to go back to those experiences and recognize that this is actually from the time when I was very, very young, and all of the things that manifest along the way are a representation of what I took to be true in my experience as a tiny little girl. And I feel like for a lot of people, that could be very helpful and empowering should they choose to look at it. I'm not crazy. I'm not all of these things. Certain
Mhm.
things weren't aligned for me when I was younger, and so now I have the opportunity to do the work to properly align them.
Yeah. I mean, a common thing I say to my clients is, you are sometimes being very hard on yourself, or really spending a lot of time being down about your current functioning when really it's functioning that's using a brain and a body which you had barely any hand in wiring up early on. So, you have essentially taken what you've been given at a very early age and you've done your best with it. That may not have been in your mind, what was ideal. But that tends to be where a lot of that discourse comes in, is like, I'm here and I want to be here. And a lot of, self-reflection and realizing that a lot of the journey that you've taken wasn't necessarily of your own choosing. It was using a body and brain, which were wired up very early on.
Absolutely. And so this brings up the question for me of like the blame game. Sometimes we
Mm-hmm.
blame our parents. We take on, and I know for many years I did a more of a victim mentality. These things are happening to me, and it's all because of these experiences that have happened. But how do you navigate that when somebody comes in and they're a victim and they're blaming all these external circumstances, beginning with their parents, for what is manifesting in their lives currently?
Well, for the most part, I think with parents, like I always say, nobody generally, wakes up and says, I hope to be a really crappy parent today. I think everybody is generally operating, extreme examples from the side, but everybody is generally operating, doing the best they have with what they've got. And so another favorite phrase of mine is, you can't give away what you never got. So if for whatever reason the parents lack, emotional maturity, they lack their own coping skills, they're, suffering from their own trauma, they're, perhaps suffering with a mental diagnosis or with, physical diagnosis. There's a million things that could have been going on for that parent at any given time. And they're likely doing the best they have with the coping skills they have. That may be completely lacking, but it's unlikely that they set out, to be bad at what they're doing. So sometimes just going back, and as we take somebody on the journey to realizing their own attachment and how that impacted them today, they also see their parent as a child and what their parents received and what that then took on for the trajectory of their lives. So, there can be a lot of interconnectedness, which doesn't necessarily mean that we, um, you know, excuse maybe some terrible things that have happened in some people's history, but we come at it from a different level of understanding. And that it's about taking that information and moving forward. A big piece of going back in therapy is just to understand current functioning in the context of the past, but we really try hard to not get stuck there and to take that information and think about, well, today forward, what can we do with that information and how can it help us, move forward as of today versus kind of going back and dwelling versus using that information in a calculated way to inform our healing.
Absolutely. I found like the word compassion comes up because in my journey it was very much about finding compassion and forgiveness. My parents did the best they could. I had a bipolar alcoholic father who just didn't show up. And,
Mm-hmm.
so I had a very unhealthy attachment bond right from the very
Yeah.
beginning, which transpired with unhealthy attachment bonds with males my entire life. But finding compassion and forgiveness and understanding that he obviously was doing the best that he could, and his father was schizophrenic. So I have no
Mm-hmm.
idea how that would have been, being in that household. So I feel like compassion on that journey is so important, compassion for ourselves, number one, and recognizing that, the the catalyst to what has brought us to where we are began very, very young and that we had absolutely no control over it. And then having compassion for where we are and for our parents who I too believe, mine anyway, tried to do the best that they could with the tools that they had. And I don't believe they had many. I believe that there are a lot of people out there whose parents didn't have a lot of tools. And this kind of brings me to emotions because emotional regulation and emotional resilience was never anything that was ever modeled to me.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, in my life, it was kids are seen but not heard. And it was cry into your pillow if you have some tears, I don't want to see them kind of thing. And I don't believe that that was done from a place of malice. I believe it was done from just the inability of parental figures to deal with any kind of emotions. So for me, I guess the next question that I would like to talk to you about as a psychologist, psychologist people come in, I believe, for a lot of like issues that they believe are like mental related, correct? Like,
Yes, that's usually the impetus to get people in. I mean, my
yes.
practice tends to be very body based, but generally people don't recognize that when they're first entering. It's usually like, is there something wrong with me and how can I quickly fix it?
Yes. So from that premise, we now begin to look into, I believe what we're going to talk about next is the emotional aspect of the imbalance, right? We come in and say we have, something like depression. And we think, okay, this depression, it's all in my mind. Let's talk about, because you and I have these conversations, and I love chatting with you about this stuff because you have so much information and scientific background to work with, but not only the fact that you also operate from a more holistic approach in that you recognize how important it is to get somebody into their body to begin to feel these emotions. So talk to us a little bit, Steph, about how emotions are connected with these imbalances that we're seeing.
Well, I could go on about this all day. I think to start, I think like emotional literacy um, in recent years has been drifting away from us. So as we get into a society that is less connected, and that can be for many reasons. It can be more disconnected because we are spending more time on screens. It can be more disconnected because physically we're in larger spaces and we're having smaller families. So there's less people, often in a bigger house, which means that, children can come home from school and somebody can go upstairs and someone can go to the basement, and, everybody's not kind of swished together around a kitchen like they would have been in the past. So again, back to that modeling idea, this idea that everything that you learn early in life about emotions is through osmosis. That is nothing that you're born with. It is purely taught to you from, the age of being a baby. So if there's not somebody kind of constantly by your side as a young child saying, what are you noticing in your body right now? How are you feeling? Oh, you can't tie your shoe. I can see there's a feeling kind of coming over you. What is that? Usually most children will be able to absorb the basics. So we'll say like happy, sad, mad. Obviously, emotions are much more nuanced than that. But you think about it, if you kind of don't have that emotional map and you are trying to tie your shoe, for instance, and it's tricky and you can't really get to it, and all you have in your repertoire is happy, sad, mad, you're like, guess this is mad. I'm going to throw this shoe, right? What you're really feeling is probably a more nuanced emotion like frustration.
Mhm.
But if you don't have someone there to label that and say, I'm frustrated in this example, or when I'm frustrated, I can sometimes feel myself getting hot. This is what it looks like in my body. That's the very early days of that emotional literacy. And that really does help to inform our interpretation of events as an adult. So if you haven't had a great opportunity for that emotional literacy, which is, again, building that prefrontal cortex where all that future emotion regulation will happen, then a lot of misinterpreting of events from that point on happens. So when you don't really understand what you're feeling in your body and you don't really have a way to label it and to interpret it and to make sense of the world around you with that lens, a lot of incongruence starts to happen. And then usually two things happen. You stuff down those feelings for a very long time because they're unfamiliar and they're kind of icky and you just don't like them. So you kind of got to like stuff to do. You got to push them down, put your head down and kind of go through life. And then they usually come out in, ways further along, physical illness, suddenly something relatively minor happens, in your adult life and a huge reaction occurs. So, that's one way. Or as a young child, your nervous system just takes over and you are usually constantly operating in a place of fight, flight, freeze because everybody is born with their limbic system intact. So everybody has fight, flight, freeze from birth. Everything else beyond fight, flight, freeze requires, again, that reciprocal reaction, requires those experiences and that interpretation. And someone essentially mentoring you for what the feelings are, how they look, how they feel, what we can do about them. So obviously people have hugely varied models when it comes to these types of things. When you don't have strong emotional literacy, you tend to tip back toward the ones that are very well developed, which again are your stress response. So as a young child at that point, you may mostly operate from the middle of your brain where your stress response lives. And for that reason, your prefrontal cortex may not get the attention that we would like, and those ability to regulate your emotions and even your memory and your cognition and all kinds of things can be impacted. So when we talk about things potentially in childhood or later in life, like ADHD, depression, anxiety, it often started with that brain development and your ability to really make sense of the world around you, how it's impacting you, what you are feeling, and to then, be able to both label that for yourself so that you can really understand your own experience in the context of that emotional literacy, and also learn to develop the skills to manage those uncomfortable feelings as they come up and to make sense of them and hopefully to prevent them from essentially kind of taking over.
Wow, what a beautiful explanation about really insanely complex organism that we are and how emotions it sounds simple, but it's they're somewhat simple, but it's not. Like it
No.
really isn't, especially as an adult who has had to work with all of these things, with feeling into my body, labeling, finding new emotions that and how they feel in my body that I didn't even know were there because likely, like you said in the beginning, being programmed to those maybe three very basic core
Mhm.
emotions. So my next question becomes cover emotions. Can we talk a little bit about cover emotions? Because sometimes we think that or we feel this way, but maybe if we go a little bit deeper, there's actually something beneath the surface.
Right. So a lot of people will come into therapy perhaps sharing an emotion that feels most safe or most comfortable. And again, that usually tips back toward their experience. So, for example, if sadness was something that your models kind of accepted from you as a reasonable response, or even as a common response, but something that they didn't like, you may come to therapy and say, my marriage is dissolving. I feel very sad, and on and on. But often as we go through therapy, we start to recognize, you're describing this as sad, but what I feel here is I hear shame. I feel guilt. These more, again, nuanced emotions that we've often almost that are so painful sometimes to acknowledge, or depending on, again, your upbringing in your early life, how you've kind of been taught what does success look like? What does, a successful life look like? What makes you valuable? I mean, we could splinter off in so many different directions for our conversation, but for whatever reason, those emotions feel very scary and very like not palatable to you because they feel like your very core value of who you are will be impacted if we kind of acknowledge that that is where those feelings lie. So instead, those are kind of that, that shame, that guilt, whatever it could be pushed down. And sad. Okay, sad is something I'm willing to kind of make peace with. It's something that I feel comfortable sharing. Sad seems to be a pretty common human experience. I'm going to tell myself sadness is what I'm feeling in this moment. Profound sadness or even depression. But once we kind of get into it, and again, we kind of start to peel back those layers, we realize, I'm sure there is sadness here, but I think it's deeper than that. I think there's something that you're struggling to really look at, or there's a place that you don't really want to go. So I'll usually say to clients, it's like we have these little filing cabinets in there, and there's some that are locked up tight and like put in the basement, and then there's some that we've kind of feel comfortable taking out and sharing with our friends and sharing with our colleagues and even with a therapist. So it's usually the files that we've really tucked away that we really would prefer not to open is usually where the growing and the healing comes from, because it's those things that we're kind of carrying around in what I usually call the computer program of our body, the background computer program that's running there all the time, whether it's conscious or not, that is significantly impacting, our emotion regulation, our physical health. All of that still exists, whether you choose to kind of acknowledge them or not. And it really is probably a driving force more than the average person realizes.
Thank you. Yeah, that's beautiful. And you brought up, conscious versus unconscious, and it was baffling to me when I found out that 90% of what we hold is actually subconscious. So we think that we have control
Mm-hmm.
over things and that we are running the program, right? I'm going to control it. I'm running the program, all of these things. But when it really comes down to it, we have very, very little control if 90% of what is actually driving these emotions and behaviors and reactions and all of these things in our lives, it's not even accessible to our conscious
Mm-hmm.
mind.
That's right. So, I mean, previously, like when I started out, when I first got out of grad school, the bulk of my practice would have been something like cognitive behavior therapy. So, it works and it is, it has good empirical evidence, but it's now in my 2025 view, it's kind of the bones. But I no longer lean toward it as my main form of therapy. So cognitive behavior therapy is just really changing the way you think, so so that you change the way you feel. So you tend to get good short-term payout for clients from that platform. So if you bring somebody in, you work through cognitive behavior therapy, for the most part, you can send them out feeling a little bit better, after 6 or 8 sessions. But you haven't fixed the computer program at all. And so therefore, they're out of therapy 6 months, they're out of therapy a year. And unless they've taken on, a different piece of their healing journey outside, that computer program is still running in the background. And I'll usually describe it as, you've improved your thinking, you've got more adaptive thinking. But low key in your life every day as you go throughout your life, there's this alarm going off, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. And after a while, it will get louder and louder. Or, of course, your body will manifest itself as like physical illness or other ailments. The alarm will make itself known one way or the other. So I guess to some extent, as I've become more skilled as a therapist, I now spend most of my time working on the alarm system. The head will follow, in my opinion, maybe perhaps even without me. But we have got to work on reprogramming first, an awareness that computer program is there. And then we've got to really work on reprogramming that nervous system is what we're really doing. Because without that, any improvement in therapy will be very short-lived. And that is why I've embraced more of a holistic, approach with my counseling, so that not only do I do that somatic work in my office, but, I'm constantly sending people out to other practitioners like yoga and sound baths and all kinds of things that really work on the nervous system, because I think that is where it's at. And if we want to have any type of long-term success, we have to work on the nervous system and to work on our body's interpretation of our emotions. And from there, I actually think if people could get that far, of course, I'm a proponent for further therapy, but I actually think people would be poised to potentially figure out the rest, themselves, because they would be approaching things from such a healthier place.
Absolutely. So you mentioned nervous system, and I talk to a lot of different practitioners. I have a lot in my circles, and I believe that everybody will and likely does agree with you who has ever been on my podcast anyway. The nervous system is the basis for our health or our imbalance. So there's a new term. I would like if we could talk briefly about fight, flight, fawn, and freeze,
Mm-hmm.
because my understanding is these are kind of the four nervous system states, and I would love for people to understand perhaps a little bit about these states, and maybe even be able to do a little bit of minor self-diagnosis and where they are generally operating. For me, it was always fight or flight, and my heart rate was through the roof, and it was just a very anxious, ramped up, ready to go kind of feeling, and until I really began working on my nervous system, even after I had taken away some of the more traumatic things that were happening in my life, I was still operating on fight or flight for years. So
Mm-hmm.
just because we remove that, traumatic experience or person or whatever it is from my life, it doesn't mean that we're good to go.
No. So again, it's that wiring, right? You think you've done the work, you have done the work in many aspects, but that wiring remains, kind of deep-seated, latent behind everything else that's going on in your life. And because your body and your brain think that maintaining that highly active nervous system is a protective measure, in as far as how your body and your brain work, it thinks like, well, just in case the other shoe is poised to drop in the future, we'll stay up and we'll stay poised to fight, flight, freeze, just in case. And it almost takes ad nauseum reminders of consistency and psychological and physical safety and work
Hmm.
before that will start to come down. So often people think that they've really kind of reached that juncture, but they don't realize how much that programming is kind of still in there. So fight, flight, freeze, faun is another one that's used, sometimes flock. So I can explain all of those. So essentially, as your stress system goes up, as your your nervous system becomes more and more activated, your typical window of tolerance gets smaller. So your window of tolerance is just how you could operate day to day for the most part if there was this, non-existent idea of neutral. So, for the most part, on a typical day, if all was well with you, here's what you could cope with. It would take X amount of things to, make you feel aggravated. It would take X amount of things to make you feel sad or to start shut down. So you kind of have this repertoire of what you could mostly handle before that starts to kind of tip into your full stress response. And that differs person to person and for all kinds of reasons. But the more stress goes up, typically the smaller that window of tolerance is. So if you have somebody who's at a very acutely stressed time in their life, or somebody who from a childhood has had a very wired up tight nervous system, their window of tolerance comparatively tends to be quite small. So their buffer between them and those big emotions, those stress responses, is much smaller than we would expect from the typical population. So that means that, as they go through day-to-day life, they just function day to day, things can tip them outside of, their regulatory zone, outside of their prefrontal cortex, and back into that midbrain, perhaps very quickly. So what that might look like, the fight can be, I see it all the time, very low frustration tolerance, curt, maybe like a little aggressive, recognizing that that you're snippy or short or less patient with your husband or your children, but you can't really put your finger on why. You don't want to be this way, but you can't help yourself. Road rage, low on patience, all these kinds of things. So that's what the fight looks like. People sometimes think that they don't have fight because they're not out like yelling and screaming, but it can be a lot more nuanced than that and a lot more, regular. So these people that, who maybe have personalities where they seem like they're just a little curt and snippy and a little crotchety, sometimes, that is their stress response. Then we have fight, flight, and freeze. So flight is just like avoid. I'm avoiding these social events. I'm not very comfortable. I think I'll just stay home today. Oh, I don't want to go over and talk to those people. I'm not going to put myself out there at work. All of these kinds of things. That's the version of flight. So you're trying to withdraw from what stresses you out, from what is a trigger for you. So you kind of self-isolate. Faun kind of comes in here too. And faun is one that kind of has a special place in my heart because I think I do it. So faun is when you kind of play yourself down. Faun is, you want to be easy breezy, you want to be liked by people. So perhaps you don't want to come across as, a know-it-all or this or that. So instead, you kind of play small. You make yourself small. You don't take up too much space. You don't really put yourself out there. You're just like easy breezy, people pleasy. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of in that faun mode. So maybe things like I pepper my speech inadvertently with things like, you know what I mean? And I know what I mean. I'm quite confident in what I'm saying. But in an effort to relate to people or maybe not, to worry that I may come across as like know-it-all-ish or that I know better than them, I'll often say, if that makes sense, if you know what I mean, these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. That's a version of faun. So again, it's just that play small, try to be a little bit invisible, try to be kind of chummy with people and maybe keep them in your orbit, keep people happy. Freeze, like a functional freeze. So many people don't know that they're in freeze. Freeze is like a shutdown. It's when you get that apathy, a flatness, maybe you kind of, become less vested in going on, what's going on in your life. Sometimes I would describe it as like, it feels like there's a window pane between you and your life and, you're going through the motions, but you're not quite there. You're looking at it from afar. It can mean you open up your emails that day and you have 100 and you say, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start. And so you just stare at it for 20 minutes and don't answer a single one. So again, I think people picture a much more exaggerated response when they say, oh, I don't do those things. But I bet all of us can relate to some extent to most of those things. So a functional freeze is really just a little bit of a checkout. So proprioception is the brain-body connection. It's your ability to really feel, what's going on in your body. Interoception is making sense of the feelings that happen. And for so many of us, a huge survival function is shutting that off. So from an early age, we feel the stress. We probably don't know it's stress. We feel something that makes us uncomfortable, makes us feel a little bit unsafe, and we don't like it. So we kind of say, push that away. I'm going to focus over here on whatever I'm doing. So a lot of us spend our entire lives trying to sever that tie of proprioception, trying to ignore what's going on in our body, all the way to things like hunger cues, if you've been somebody who's kind of been a victim of diet culture, things like that. So just ignoring the cues that our body is giving us. And then suddenly, perhaps you're 40 years old and you're in a therapist's office and someone's saying, tune in, what's going on for you? And, without knowing it, it's like, well, I've been perfecting tuning out for this entire 40 years. And it's really difficult. This is a new skill that I now have to learn. So again, that's a big part of what we're doing in therapy is trying to do that, tune in. And I'm sure similar to the work that you do, what is actually going on in there? And it takes quite a bit of introspection, quite a bit of stepping back, from what we're used to really reconnect. And that can be sometimes painful because obviously what we're reconnecting to is difficult, and we likely kind of sever those ties for a reason. So in many areas of my work, I spend trying to work on that idea of prior perception. The last one was flock, which you'll hear sometimes. Bruce Perry in particular, he uses that term. So flock just means finding similar people. So it's essentially the concept of like trauma bonding. So flock means, you find other people that maybe have had tumultuous upbringings. You find other people who have perhaps been in bad relationships, because there's a normalizing factor. So, from children who might come from like really difficult homes, impoverished homes, home where there's drug use, parent in prison, those types of things. That's a population that I work with sometimes, and they will all find each other. You could be in a school of 700 children, and for whatever reason, these children kind of tend to gravitate together. That in itself is a stress response. That sense of belonging is still there, whether or not they identify, that that's what's driving it. And so the flock is just kind of finding like-minded people. Comes up a lot also in my therapy with relationships, with trauma bonding. Two people that are working through their own things or not working through will often, find one another, and kind of their trauma will play off of one another, and can kind of be quite difficult to dismantle. So yeah, I guess that's like the bones of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flock, which again is the foundation for so much of my work, and really the foundation for so much, I think, of what's going on for most people at the core.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. That's really, really helpful, and I'm sure that listeners have a lot to reflect on just after having that information. I'm going to definitely listen to this again, watch it again, because you articulate things so beautifully in a way that's very understandable, I believe, for everyone. So whether you have an idea of the mechanics behind the psychological, psycho-emotional connection, or whether you don't, the way that you've brought things together is in very simplistic terms that I believe that most people can navigate and understand and begin to have some perhaps new level of awareness of now the importance of the nervous system, maybe some ability to look into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and flock, and see which parts of those are playing out in their own lives. I know that one of my teachers, and I always say this, your vibe attracts your tribe, right? So that's exactly what you said with flock,
Mm-hmm.
right? We as our vibrational level changes, as we release more and more of those deeply seated emotions, we find that the people in our lives can begin to change too. Relationships are here to show us things, and either they're going to, we're going to mirror and play things out together to resolve some of our previous traumatic issues, or we're
Mm-hmm.
going to continue to perpetuate them together. And I mean that difference is self-awareness, right? Becoming aware of ourselves and our role, and not the projection factor that
Mm-hmm.
often comes in when we're working with relationship issues within ourselves and other people.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
That's beautiful. So this brings me to the next part, because now I wanted to ask you um, for the types of not solutions, but what people can begin to work with. Obviously, what you work with as a psychologist and a registered practitioner, but what are some of the other things? Not only that, but also what are some of the things other people who are identifying some of these imbalances and some behaviors and things that they might be able to look for these tools on their journey as well.
Um, Such a big question, but I guess in a nutshell, how I will describe it to clients is, brains respond to brains and bodies respond to bodies. So what I mean by that is, if you come in with a phobia and you're afraid of needles, or to some extent, the very surface of anxiety, you have some irrational thinking and some irrational fears. Well, then something like CBT is a good mechanism for that. We think about, where are your thoughts, what's the thoughts need to change, what that could look like, what that internal dialogue that we tell ourselves could change. So in that way, we're kind of intellectualizing the problem, and we're matching it with, more to some extent rational thinking. And that is where our therapy is based. And that would be, for my chair, the easiest type of therapy, less common as well. The therapy I work in primarily all the time, on the other hand, is bodies. And so I can, have my best knowledge and I can try my best to articulate things in a way that's meaningful for people, but we can't talk our way out of an overactive nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
We can't read about it. We can't study it. We can't, again, like we can't learn it away. We can learn what we need to do, but ultimately those solutions are going to be body based. So to start with the very basics, I'll ask my clients right from the get-go, how are you sleeping? Do you get fresh air? Are you eating? These kinds of things. And I think a lot of times I think, oh, it's like so loud, like low down on my priority list. Like if that
Mm-hmm.
was the solution, I wouldn't have found my way here. But the truth is that that is always the place to start. Because if you aren't doing those things, or if you don't have a handle on those things, whatever else is on the surface that you feel like is your biggest priority is being exacerbated so far by the lack of those other things. So if we really want to work on our nervous system, we really want to tune in to what's going on in our body, we need to start by doing things where we start listening to our body. So breathing obviously is number one. So again, I sometimes get met with a little eye roll, like if breathing was the solution, I could have done that already. But people feel like breathing needs to be like going through, extensive breath work or having some kind of meditation. But I'll always tell people like it's much simpler than that. And everything in life really boils down to intention. So, you could go away and spend thousands of dollars and go on like a big retreat where all you did for a week was breathe and do yoga and all these kinds of things. But if you aren't really there with the intention of allowing that mechanism to really meet you at like a cellular level and to really begin to, again, connect you back to your body, then it can be somewhat inadvertently, but performative, like you're going through the motions, but you're
Mm-hmm.
not really taking from that exercise what we want you to take. So I always tell people, I would rather see you wake up a half an hour before the rest of your family, to pour a cup of coffee and sit there and put your phone aside and just take a couple big deep breaths. And if you can do that for me, every day for 10 minutes, it's okay if you never make it to meditation. It's okay if you never make it to some of the more structured things that we can do, because you are beginning your day every day with that intention of like connecting back with your body and noticing how you're feeling and, giving your body the time and your space to start out your day in a better way and to, have the, I guess, connection there to feel what you might need to address as the day goes on. So it's the bulk of this healing will occur from trying to make an effort to tune back in. Likewise, you might say, I'm going for a walk every day, but I'll say, well, okay, cool. Where do you walk? And then I'd be like, well, I walk all around my subdivision for 2 hours. And I'll say, maybe a 10-minute walk in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Do you like, for me, I really find water very
Mm-hmm.
soothing, very, important to my nervous system regulation. So I will seek out water. I will go in my backyard and sit by my pond. I will go to a river. I will go park on the beach. And I can get more by taking in, for me, that, time to take a couple of deep breaths by the water than I could from a big 2-hour walk. So again, it's about the intention. It's not, for fitness purposes, or it's not for check off a box and say you went to meditation or you went to yoga. It's about what are you doing? And I think people are shocked sometimes by how small that amount of time can be when it's really done with intention. And the other thing about nervous systems is they don't need, a big amount of stuff, a small amount of time. They need instead consistency, consistency, consistency. So if your nervous system is going to, quote unquote, let down its guard after all this time of being on high alert, it's going to need daily, consistent reminders that you are safe, that you are in control, that that you no longer have to allow those patterns to drive the bus, we'll say, of your life. And it's going to need that reminder over and over and over and over again before it's even going to kind of consider coming back. So I'll usually use, pretend numbers, but I'll say, if you're at a 10 out of 10, your nervous system, your computer program is at a 10 out of 10. For that 10 minutes, you take those deep breaths in the morning with your coffee. For just a minute, your body may get a chance, a little glimpse at like what it looks like to be an 8 out of 10 or a 7 out of 10. And then, as your children wake up and as you get to work and all that and the stress comes back, sure, you're going to shoot back up to a 10 out of 10, but you've just shown your body there's somewhere else to be besides this 10 out of 10 all the time that we've completely normalized as being our baseline. So if you're able to incorporate these little glimmers of breathing, physical activity, cutting out screens and focusing on quality of sleep, And then obviously even better is if we can incorporate some more structured things, like some of the things I'll tip people toward, like somatic based yoga, like vagal nerve practices, like things like a sound bath, which is like a guided meditation, something that maybe makes it more accessible for you to kind of relax and to tune into your body. Well, then that's even better again. But sometimes people are not ready for those ideas, or those ideas seem a little airy fairy to them or something. So I sometimes have to like win them over, first with I try to make an accessible explanation of, why we are doing these things. And then when I need to, I'll bring in neuroscience and explain, well, here's why it's important, and here's what it is doing for your brain, and here's what it is doing for your body. So it might seem like you didn't need to come to a therapist and, pay this money to find out that you needed to, spend more time in nature or do some deep breathing. But the truth is that, that is the core of where healing is going to come from. It can be almost seem that simple, but it's actually quite hard in practice, and it's quite hard to do it with that same intention. So sometimes that requires a little bit of guidance.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. Everything done with intention, right? It's not what you do, it's how you do it. It's pausing and taking those deep breaths and grounding your feet into the earth and walking barefoot and recognizing the power and the energy of just being outside and breathing fresh air versus sitting behind your desk and taking 5 breaths. Like there's so many different and tools that don't cost a lot of money because not everyone has a lot of money to invest at this time and place in things like therapy and we totally recognize that. So we can do what we can do with the tools that we're given, and so we're all given breath.
Mm-hmm.
We're all given access to nature, and these are beautiful ways to begin that journey inward. And again, you and I, we come from very different backgrounds. Me more from very holistic and energy medicine and these kinds of things, and you more from scientific, but we are amalgamating, meeting each other in the middle and recognizing, whether it's whoever it is, we all really kind of need the same things in our lives, right? We need to be grounded, we need to spend time with ourselves, and we need to create and recognize the value of creating time and space for our own physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being, because I feel like society has programmed us to look outside. I have a problem. I need to look outside of me. Who can help me? Help me here, help me there. When in fact, a lot of times just pausing and slowing down and taking the time to connect inside can give us some of the answers that perhaps would have cost us thousands of dollars on the outside.
I'll joke to clients usually like the Wizard of Oz analogy, like it was in you all along. You just needed somebody to bring you there and to kind of guide you. But I work from the platform. The client is the expert in their own life. And, I'm just there to kind of guide them to maybe help them get some insight, but they know what they need at the core. And, they've probably spent many years denying that truth,
Yes.
but it's just about kind of reconnecting them with that.
Yes, me too. Yeah, that's beautiful. Thanks, Steph. So I guess in kind of conclusion, is there anything else that you wanted to mention today? Anything else that you feel listeners may need to know as we close up for today? As they maybe some people this will inspire them to embark on an entirely new journey that they never even considered after listening to our chat today.
Um, I think the idea that we'll also sometimes use a little antidote of like connection over direction. So, whether that's connecting with yourself or connecting with the therapist, the core of any work that you're going to do with any practitioner over any platform is that ability to connect and to hold space for people and to provide a place where, those previously packed away ideas, values, emotions can come up in a safe place. So I think if you're just, beginning your journey and you're either seeking out formal therapy or you're just beginning to kind of connect with yourself and your own body in that way, it is just about essentially it's at the rapport you're building with yourself, the rapport you're building with an outside connection, because though that psychological safety and that sense of physical safety that is built on that relationship is where all the healing is going to happen. So, it can take some time to get to kind of connect with ourselves again and to feel safe in doing so. So making an effort to hold space for yourself and to check in with yourself, like as a very, mini beginning, just to be able to take a few moments quiet, away from screens, away from your family, away from the hustle and bustle of every day, and just say, what's going on for me? How am I feeling? Is there something that I feel like I've maybe been carrying or ignoring for a long time that could potentially be impacting me? Or likewise, if you meet with a therapist, the single best predictor of how that therapy is going to go is your rapport with the therapist. So I'll usually say to people, right, from session one, you can kind of catch like a vibe from somebody. And I think you'll generally know pretty quickly
Mhm.
if your work with that person will be productive or not. And I do believe that sometimes, just like in life, you're with a therapist perhaps for a season or a particular thing, and then you might want a new lens and a new set of skills.
Mhm.
So I'm all about, many hands and like work. If someone comes to see me for a period of time and we've kind of reached the end of our journey together, and then they can start with someone else. So I think wraparound service, connection, connection, connection. And although we didn't really touch on it, I guess, medication is a big part sometimes of people's healing, and it's there for a reason. And I'm
Mhm.
certainly not negative toward medication if
Mhm.
it's needed. I think if somebody's at, a 10 out of 10 and their quality of life has really dwindled, or they, are unsafe in
Mhm.
some ways, then medication is where we need to go to kind of take the edge off.
Mhm.
But I do think the medication is never the root of healing.
Mhm.
Medication allows people to access the healing by taking them down just a couple notches so that they can do the work that we've been discussing today. So I don't want people to be afraid of medication, but I
Mhm.
also don't want people to think that I can get this medication, I will be fixed, because I can guarantee that that is not where the healing lies. It's just a mechanism to promote you to be able to access the healing. So whatever, I guess, step of the journey that you're on, or whatever place you are in your kind of healing journey, just taking stock of just the next few steps, because when we look at it as an entire start to finish, if there is such a thing as finish, it can seem absolutely overwhelming.
Mhm.
And I think it prevents people sometimes from getting started.
Definitely.
So that saying goes, you don't have to see the whole staircase to take the next step. Just boil it down to what is one step I can do in the right direction. And even though I'm full of like little quips, I guess I'll usually say to clients, like raindrops in a bucket. It's 10 minutes of breathing here. It's a little fresh air here. It's a little introspection here. All small things that in and by themselves, they think like, oh my gosh, it's so small, I can't possibly do much. But if you start incorporating these practices, all over your life consistently, quickly the momentum builds. And, it's actually kind of amazing to watch how much healing can take place with just some small tweaks and changes generally in the average person's life.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. That's wonderful. And I totally agree because all of those things that you've said, I've lived on my journey. Was a tool. Medication was a tool that served me well in the times that I needed it. And without that medication, I don't know that I would have had the capacity to move to the next step because there was just too much. So when I always say, like with clients, we're building our tool belt. We're building our tool belt of all these different um, options that we can eventually use. So today I might need the tool of medication. Tomorrow will be the breath work. The next day it will be a cleansing breath because I know that I need to move things through my body. The next day will be grounding breath. Next day I'll be meditating, like all of these different things. And coming back to what you said about consistency, I know in my own journey, showing up for myself consistently every day. And it only started with, 5 minutes. 5 minutes every day of doing some of those things, checking in with my body, taking a few deep breaths, moving a little bit. It changed. It changed the trajectory of my journey. And it wasn't, and I have another teacher who always says, motivation is the secondary experience of consistency. And when we are not motivated, we aren't consistent. But unfortunately, it kind of works the other way around. We need to we need to show up for ourselves when the times are really difficult. And then we will begin to see how the changes that we are making transpire and support the evolution that we are moving toward on our journeys. So thank you, Steph. Last question. I know that your practice is full. Unfortunately, those of you who love Steph, she's not taking any clients at this time. However, I thought I would ask you if this resonated for listeners and they wanted to connect with someone in particular. I feel the one of the more beautiful aspects of what we've talked about today is the somatics connection.
Mhm.
If someone wanted to connect with a psychologist, and they would definitely need to ask, is that correct, about somatics, if that was part of their practice, how would they find someone?
So usually, an easy, most common answer would be to check the regulatory body for where you live. It is required to be published. So there's a list of registrants that, here in Canada, in the States, it may be called licensure, but it works very similarly. So here in Canada, you can check any province, you can get a list of all the registered psychologists who are, in good standing and practicing. And then usually most psychologists also publish a small biography about themselves. So look for words like polyvagal theory, somatic work. Those are all clues that that person works in the area of body or somatic work. And then if you're not certain and you've, narrowed it down to getting a couple of names, you can always ask them. So, what platform do you work from, or what is your preferred, we call it like, your framework that you would be working from. So you can, it doesn't, you can do a little mini interview. It doesn't hurt to ask questions. Make sure you feel aligned with that person's area of practice and that you feel like their area of practice is aligned with what you need. And, any psychologist is going to be only too happy to talk a little bit about how they work, what, disciplines that they draw from, those kinds of things. So a great place to get the original list would be the regulatory body. And then from there, you can, a lot of places now have websites. You can read biographies. You can see a little bit about their training, a little bit about their preferred frameworks. Just like I mentioned in my bio, I kind of hit on the things that I'm, most interested in or that I've done additional training in. So most people operate in a similar manner.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much, Steph. I greatly appreciate your time today and all that you have shared. It's been so incredibly valuable. I can't wait to listen to this episode again. And I know that it's going to be likely quite profound for some people when they listen to the level of explanation that you've given for things that we feel. And that is such a gift. So thank you for sharing your gifts with me and with listeners today. Again, I'm so incredibly grateful, and I hope that we can do this again.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for tuning in to Feel, Peel, Thrive. I'm so grateful you're here and part of this space for reflection and growth. If something from today's episode spoke to you, please share it with a friend or someone who might need it. And take a moment to rate, comment, or leave a short review for me on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. It really helps the podcast to grow and keeps these conversations flowing to more people who are ready to shift how they see health and healing. Together, we can help more people feel, peel, and thrive from the inside out.